Hello everyone, welcome to the show. Mitch, so great to be with you.
Good to be with you.
And I get to have you all to myself and talk about a really important topic.
Yeah, this is a real important issue that we've been working on for years here in Denver.
SANE, what does that acronym stand for?
Well, it's for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners, and it usually comes in the terms with a program. And so this is a specially trained nurse that is trained in doing a thorough sexual assault examination, which includes not only the physical examination, the collection of evidence, the documentation of evidence with drawings and photographs, but also what is incredibly important is a lengthy interview of what actually happened to you. So asking the victim, where did the person touch you? Did the person kiss you? Did the person, touch your breasts? That type of thing, where then during the examination, they can look for DNA in that situation.
And so what's the history? Has there always been a SANE program?
Not in Denver. It was about 10, 12 years ago. We got together with the Sexual Assault Interagency group, and I was actually on it at the time, and we really pushed to have Denver Health do a SANE nurse program. And it was not that they weren't doing the examinations. They weren't using specially trained nurses to do it. They were actually using interns to do it. So they were doctors. But they were doctors in the emergency room. And these were doctors that were trying to save people's lives, doctors that were dealing with victims that had been shot, victims that had been stabbed. Denver Health is phenomenal when it comes to that kind of trauma. I think our homicide rate would probably be double or triple what it is if it wasn't for Denver Health. But what would happen is then the rape victims who weren't injured necessarily, weren't shot, weren't stabbed, obviously if they were, and that does happen in rapes, that was taken care of, but they were kind of pushed aside. The other thing is they were sitting there with people that were extremely intoxicated, people that were bleeding, all those things that you see in an emergency room. And so we knew we had to do better in Denver. We put together our SANE nurse program. Shortly after that, then Denver Health remodeled the emergency room, and as part of that, they put in a special suite for these nurses to work in. And it's a small room. It's about the size of the set here. 2 rooms. One is a waiting room, and one is a examination room. It's one person at a time. Obviously, we don't have a big line of people waiting to have these examinations, but we had to have the people trained to do it, and so we started a training program. We got nurses to sign up that wanted to do it. We put them through a class. I actually taught at one of the classes. We graduated our first group of nurses. I think it was about 10 or 12, and then they started their work. It's a 24-hour-a-day service. Sometimes the nurse has to be called in. Sometimes the nurse is doing something else already at the hospital. They come in. They're highly trained. They're specialists in doing these examinations. It's both an internal and an external examination, and obviously the collection of the DNA evidence or any other evidence is critical to us going forward then on a sexual assault case.
So you touched on it just a bit, but go a little bit further. Talk to us about the steps that the victim goes through when you walk in.
Well, the program is set up in a way that a victim could just walk in, but that's not the way it usually happens. They usually come in with the officer that they've called. And the amazing thing about all the crime shows and all of the special, true crime and law and order is victims really realize these days that when they've been the victim of this kind of crime, that their body is the crime scene, their clothing. We used to always hear, hey, I took a bath before I called anybody, or I took a shower. We've seen rapists that make their victims do that. But, in the last 10, 15 years, people, they realize, hey, this needs to be collected. This is going to help catch the guy who did this to me. And so we see they come in with their clothing, which is collected as evidence as well by the SANE nurse and then given to the police officer. But then there's a rape examination that's done, and it's a kit that the officers have that they can provide if it's a hospital that doesn't have a program like this, because we still do have a few hospitals in Denver, although many have moved, that sometimes need the kit from the officer. Mm-hmm. But our program has its own kits. The kits are made up by the Denver Crime Lab, and they eventually end up back at the Denver Crime Lab once the evidence has been collected. The first part of the examination is that lengthy interview. There's questions about physical injuries, those types of things. If a victim does have bruising or a victim does have a bloody lip or something along those lines, those are going to be documented with cameras, photographs, sometimes drawings, and then there's an examination for tears, and we have a special, it's called a copiscope, that does that type of photography as well for both external and internal examination. Then there's Q-tips there, basically. Everything's sterile that are taken out. There's swabs done of the victim's body, both internally and externally. But also we need a reference sample of the victim's DNA. So we will take a swab from inside her mouth. And then that's all put back into the rape kit and sealed once it's dried. It's important that it's dried, and they have a swab dryer there for that purpose.
And they didn't used to have a dryer.
No, they didn't
How did
have
that come
one.
about?
In fact, when the suite opened, they did a little celebration, and as the DA and as part of putting together this SANE nurse program, I thought, okay, I'll go. And when I'm there, I was like, whoa, what a great setup. Do you guys need anything? And they said, yeah, we need a swab dryer. And I said, okay. So we went about using a nonprofit that would match any money that we raised. And my office, obviously we dress like this, and we gave jean days is what we call them. And so to pay $20 to wear jeans, and then every dollar we raised was matched. And we were able to raise a couple $1,000s that way, and then we were able to buy them a swab dryer.
And why is it important to have that evidence dried versus staying
Well,
wet?
the thing about DNA is that, it's going to come to you in a form where it's probably not dry yet because of a crime scene. But the way to preserve it, the best way to preserve it is to dry it first. And then when it gets to the lab, they're going to freeze it. And that'll allow them to keep it, those cells then are kept for years. You want to keep it away from the sun, you want to keep it away from bleach, you want to keep it away from bacteria. And even though we don't have a lot of humidity here, humidity and the wrong kind of packaging on a wet sample is going to cause you to get mold, mildew, and the type of bacteria that loves to eat up your DNA. And if you store it wrong, you don't dry it, there's a potential of damaging and losing the evidence that you have collected.
So let me back up a little bit and go back to the SANE examiners, the nurses. Do they then become part of the investigation, and do they actually testify in court?
Yeah, they testify as experts in court. They're not police officers, they're civilians. They're doing their examination for a dual purpose, not only a medical analysis of the victim. They are going to take blood from the victim if the victim's saying that, or urine sample if they're saying that there was a date rape drug involved. They're going to try to capture all the evidence that they can capture depending on what that interview tells them. Then they become witnesses, but because they are nurses and not police officers, they are able to testify to things that the victim told them. Because the hearsay rule would prohibit a police officer sometimes from testifying unless it was an excited utterance or some exception. But because it's for the purpose of examination, both medical and forensic, the nurses can testify to what the victim told them in order to explain to the jury why maybe they swabbed the back of the victim's neck. And we had a case where a woman was raped in a parking garage, and the critical DNA that we got off of her body came from a SANE nurse listening closely to the story and saying, this guy kept kissing on the back of my neck. and that's where we found his saliva. And based on that, we got a DNA hit, and we were able to then find the guy that lived in the apartment house, matched the DNA on the back of her neck, and she didn't know him, but we were able to get a conviction on that case.
So once all of the evidence is collected and you've got the rape kit, what happens next? Where does it go?
Well, once it's dry, it came in a packaging, which is an evidence envelope. They're white boxes. Everything goes back in the box. Everything's kept separate within the box. And then it goes into a cabinet, which is locked. And somebody from the crime lab then comes in daily, opens that cabinet, and then takes those rape kits, or that rape kit. Same thing happens at the coroner's office. They have evidence they collect in an autopsy, and they do actually do a rape kit as well on a victim. That rape kit is the same, and it is kept then under lock and key until somebody from the crime lab comes and gets it. Then they transport it over to the Property Bureau, which is under police headquarters. They put it into evidence, or they take it directly to the lab and they put it in a situation where the chain of custody is maintained. So when we talk about a chain of custody, the nurse would testify, yes, that's the packaging because I wrote on it, initialed that swab that I did when I did the swabbing. That then went to this person. That person documents everything they did in transporting it to the lab. Then the DNA analyst is going to do the same kind of thing, put their initials on it. This is the swab I tested, and then we're able to then show that chain of custody in court. So it's very important, the documentation. And one of the things the SANE nurse program did is it improved all of that. Because I used to go over with Jeannie Kilmer from the crime lab, our first DNA analyst, when I was a chief deputy on Saturday mornings. We would do a training of all these doctors in waiting, you know, the intern guys, and we would tell them, listen, you've got to document this stuff. And sometimes they'd seal it up without putting their initials on it. Doctors notoriously sign their names in ways that you can't read them.
Right.
And so we would then have to go back and hunt out who did this examination. How do you know you did this? And we would have holes in our chain of custody. That doesn't happen anymore. The other thing is the nurses tend to stay around. They stay in Colorado, or we can find them. Remember, when you're in medical school, you may be in medical school in Denver, and part of this program at Denver Health and University of Colorado, and we had a triangle of different hospitals that would do these. But then you might go back to the Middle East and practice medicine. And so that happened to me in a serial rape case. We had to fly a young man from Saudi Arabia who had gone to medical school here, then gone home here to get in that evidence in a serial rape case, and he did just one of the 8 rape kits that we had in that case. But it's extremely important evidence to us and to the victims.
Right. It's interesting to me that a police report may or may not be filed in these cases. Talk a little bit about that.
You know, it's up to the victim. It really is. I think that's federal law. It's the Violence Against Women's Act, that it basically said that if a victim wants a rape kit done, she has a right to get it done. If she does not want to deal with the police, she has a right to do that too. So there may or may not be a police report filed. But really what happens is, even though a police report might not be filed, the rape kit is done. And I've described how it then is processed over to the crime lab. There's no place to just keep these rape kits at the SANE nurse program, at the hospital. They don't have a place to do that. So the part about it going to the police, the part about it being stored at the crime lab and the chain of custody, all of that has to be kept. So a victim may not fill out a police report and may not want to remain anonymous. That doesn't mean that her DNA that's going to be in the rape kit as a reference sample, or sometimes in the evidence sample, is not going to go to the crime lab. Now, it might sit and not get tested, and it might be then a number of those types of rape kits that go untested. And you know, nationally there's been a big issue about untested rape kits. But sometimes it's because the victim just wants the evidence preserved and doesn't necessarily want the police or the crime lab to do anything about it. What we find in Denver is that when they come in, they get tested. And so if there's a result there or not, there may be a match, but nobody's filed a police report, so the case just sits.
But they can come back at any point and say, now I actually do want to file a police report.
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, since I've been the DA, we got the law changed to allow no statute of limitations on a rape if DNA is used.
Yeah.
So the key is preserving the evidence. If the victim comes back 5 years later and says, I want to report this, I was the victim of this, I wasn't capable, or there was some situation going on in my life at the time that didn't allow me, or I didn't want to, but now I do. We have the evidence, and the case can still be proceeded on. We used to lose those cases after 3 years, and we got it extended to 10 years, and then if DNA is involved, there's no statute of limitations. So it's important, and that's what really this is all about with the SANE Nurse program. This evidence is fleeting. This evidence can be washed away, this evidence can be destroyed, clothing get thrown out, those types of things. So the key is you don't know what you have, do the examination, preserve the evidence, and then the investigation can take place sometime later, maybe 2 or 3 days later, maybe a week later, and if the victim chooses, maybe even a year or 2 later.
Wow. So let me see if I have this straight. Denver now has all rape kits tested, right? Testing some of them in the Denver crime lab,
right,
and then sending some to the state for testing.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, the Colorado legislature picked up on this movement to test all rape kits. And when you talk to like the Cleveland DA and the Manhattan DA, they really call it the forklift approach, where you just pick up all your rape kits, ship them to the crime lab, and have them all tested. And that's really the forklift approach. And so the Colorado legislature said, fine, we'll do that. All rape kits shipped off to the Colorado Bureau of Investigations for testing. So Denver's part of Colorado, and even though they have their own crime lab, we have limited resources in that crime lab. So we did have untested rape kits. We had gone through and evaluated those rape kits to see if they would help us advance the ball in these cases. We did a thorough investigation of all of those rape kits, and what we found was there was a certain number of those where consent was the issue, and the DNA wasn't going to answer any questions. So those got low priority. When we had cases with strangers and kids and violence, those got high priority. And that was our cold case program, and it's still an ongoing program. We're primarily into the homicides now and done almost all of those, what I call probative rape kits. But it's a limited resource, so you had to evaluate and prioritize. Under the forklift method, you just ship them off. You do all of them. And so when the legislature passed that law, we said, fine, but the Denver crime lab's not going to do these. We're going to send them to another good lab in the state, and they're going to do them. And actually what they did is they got money, and they shipped them off to private labs. And then they came back to us. And we've gotten a number of hits to these, what I call non-probative rape kits. They come back in, you've got a hit to this guy, we know his name, the Denver police reinvestigate the case. They find out it's the guy they knew whose DNA it was going to be. They represent it to us, and we haven't filed a single case in all of these hits. And so what we're seeing is a large number of hits that really aren't investigative leads because they don't answer a question in the investigation. Now, there are parts of this country where they didn't do it the way we did it, that they didn't have an active cold case program, and they weren't testing probative rape kits. And so when you read about this issue in places like Detroit and Cleveland, and places where the police were dropping the ball and investigators were not asking for testing to be done, they're solving cases with the forklift method. So it's a method that works in places where people didn't get what DNA was about. But in Denver, we've gotten it for a long time. We were a leader in the country around DNA and DNA evidence. It's part of why we did this SANE nurse program. Because one, we knew that victims needed to be treated with more dignity and respect than what we were doing in Denver. And that was embarrassing to me and to everybody that was involved in this process. So we improved that. But the other thing we knew is that in those cases where DNA was going to give you the answer, you needed to get those tested.
Right.
And if there was some of those rape kits that were sitting there and untested, those needed to get tested. So we applied for grants. The city of Denver got well over $3 million over the course of a decade to get that important work done. And I'm really proud of that cold case program, because we didn't then have to revert to this kind of, nobody's doing this, nobody cares about it, let's just ship them all off.
Right.
Part of the Colorado statute that does concern me, though, is there is a time limit for how soon they have to get these rape kits in, if they're probative or not. So what happens potentially is a non-probative rape kit, a rape kit that's going to tell you what you already know from your investigation, leapfrogs a murder case that may have DNA that's not in the form of a rape examination, blood on a shirt, that type of thing, where you could be using that resource to go after a murderer, but because of the Colorado statute, you have to do this non-probative rape kit first. That concerned me about that law. But really, you know, I think it's important to get the probative rape kits done. And if there was a place in Colorado where they weren't getting that done, this law then forces that. That's important. A rapist in Pueblo may end up being a rapist in Denver. You know, I'm fine with all of that. There were some problems with the law, but you know, I've never seen a law there wasn't problems with.
Right.
So
let me ask you just one question as we wrap up in the next 30 seconds here. What have you heard from the victims about the SANE program and how they're treated now versus the victims who were treated before this came into place 10, 12 years ago?
You know, they really establish a rapport with these nurses. These nurses really care about hearing what happened to them. You know, rape is such a devastating thing for someone to go through. It takes years if you ever get over it. It is a violation that, short of murder, you know, it's just one of those things you never, and it takes victims years to get over it. And they see that SANE nurse as somebody that cared about what happened to them, that it mattered, that they got the evidence collected, and that they did it in a right way. And it's a time where somebody really needs somebody like that.
Yeah, they need not just the police investigation, but they need a shoulder.
Absolutely.
Thanks for bringing this topic to our attention.
Well,
Really
thank
appreciate
you,
it.
because you wanted to hear about it.
That's
So
right.
I appreciate that.
Thanks, Mitch. That's it for this edition of Dialogue Denver DA. I'm Tamara Banks. We'll see you next time.